You may know her from the excellent Ask the Lawyer series, a service provided by the Northern New York Library Network, and to which any NCLS member library can submit questions. Today's presentation centers on library ethics, policies, board meetings and governance, and New York State and federal laws pertaining to libraries, presented in a Jeopardy-style format for fun and collaborative learning. Without any further delay, this is North Trivia!
Hello, everyone. For those of you who previously knew me as the lawyer who does Ask the Lawyer, you now know me as the lawyer who wore this silver suit to the NCLS 75th anniversary. I'll share with you real quick, we have a lot to cover in a very little time, but I will say I may have been feeling a little off myself a couple weeks ago because I was shopping at Target to get my son the supplies for his first apartment on his own. He's 18, right? So there I am buying, like towels, because what 18-year-old doesn't want to make sure he has an adequate supply of towels? And I see this silver suit, and I'm like, literally, I have not really worn a suit except for to court and since before the pandemic, right? Suits kind of went out the window, but I was like, I want to own that suit. And then my voice went, where are you going to wear that suit? You can't wear that to court. And then we got the invite, and they said, wear something sparkly. And I was like, it's fate. It's fate. So, and you all look so fantastic, and it is just a joy to be here with you. And I just loved hearing that history that Lauren went over, and that spirit of connectedness is just something that I can really, really feel, and it's amazing. So I'm going to encourage you to really embrace that spirit of connectedness for this exercise. So take a look at the table you're with, and you can decide right now, are you collaborators or are you rivals? Because each of you has a worksheet, and as we go, I'm gonna queue up the quiz questions and the Jeopardy categories, and I'm gonna encourage you to work collaboratively or to see who can be the first off the mark to say, I got that one. All right? And in that spirit, we're going to embrace collaborative learning. There's no wrong answers. If you get it wrong, it just means this was an opportunity to learn. And if you get it right, everybody will know how smart you are. Win-win. So what we're going to do is we're going to warm up with the quiz that you see on the first page. Okay, so if you go to your first page there, and let me make sure my clicker is happening. I'm clicking. This is good. All right, so in New York State, a public library is an association library, a municipal library, a school district public library, a special district public library, or E, all of the above. Yes! This is how this is going to go. You got it, all right? That was an easy warm-up one, but honestly, sometimes people do not understand that association libraries are also public libraries because the term public can sometimes get conflated with municipal or official. And so you just want to make sure you stress, for those of you who's from an association library here, say, we're a public library too. Go ahead, we're a public library too. Yeah, exactly, right? So just correct that gently whenever that comes up. All right, moving on to page 2. Question 2. Oh, maybe it's on. Oh, it's still on page 1, sorry. All public libraries are governed by which one? Ooh, all right, don't worry, they get harder. You did it. Flip into 3. A library system like NCLS is A, a government agency, B, an education corporation, or C, the governing body of all its member libraries. The answer is B, okay? It is not a, so your cooperative library system, your cooperative library system is not a government agency. All right, it is a proud education corporation chartered by the state of New York. All right, and it is not, and I'm going to say this: it may lead, it may coordinate, right? But libraries in New York, each one is an independent education corporation on its own that is governed by the trustees, right? And that's a really important thing to recognize, and it's one of the elements of the critical network that we've been talking about and celebrating. Each one of your institutions is its own standalone institution, right, that draws strength and lends its strength to a collaborative network. So the governance that your trustees are providing and that the directors are facilitating, right, to enable that to happen, That's what makes you strong, and then you connect that strength. And your NCLS system is what helps you make that connection point. So for those of you how many quilters do we have? This is right. This is a very good quilting analogy. You're a beautiful quilt of independent patches that have been sewn together, but each of you has your own unique weave and identity. So, number 4. All right. Every trustee must fill out and turn this in before they start their term of office. All right. Yeah. So, yeah, I just heard good luck with that, right? The answer is, in fact, C, the conflict of interest form. All right. So, every one of the libraries is also, it's governed by the education law. We're going to get to that. But you're also governed by the not-for-profit corporation law of the state of New York. The not-for-profit corporation law requires that when someone is serving as a director, or in your case, a trustee, that conflict form is filled out before you start service. And when you think about it, that makes total sense, right? You don't want to get on the board and then find out you might have a conflict you need to disclose. You want to enter into the relationship of being a trustee conflict-free, right? So ideally, the form should be filled, not ideally, by law. By law. The conflict form should be filled out first, and then of course on an annual basis, and the conflict form can also be filled out whenever you need to disclose a conflict. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that further on as well. So, all right. A library board directly supervises A, all library employees, B, the director, or C, day-to-day operations at the library. The answer to this is emphatically B. All right, so and there's a difference between governance and operational oversight, right? Governance is the act of passing the policies, passing that annual report you heard about in the annual in the standards, right? But it is not the day-to-day operations. Now, I work with a lot of not-for-profit organizations, so not just libraries, religious organizations, educational institutions, and I know that very often it is the volunteers, including the trustees and the directors, who do a lot more than just pass the policies. At my own church, the UU of Buffalo, the man who was the treasurer was also the guy who mowed the lawn for many years, right? That is just a fact of life of keeping a not-for-profit running. But what we aim for is governance is happening, and the line of supervision is the library board to the director, and then the director is really having that other oversight. And whenever you need help on that balance, that's a good thing to consult with the collaborative library system, the cooperative library system about, to get some input on that. Because again, a lot of times I do know that the volunteers are going to power those things, but this is what we aim for. All right. Sorry, I brought down the room with that one. let's talk about chartering. That's always a party topic. The government unit that charters libraries in New York is Department of State, the State Attorney General, or the Department of Education. Yeah, all right. Very nice. The bylaws of a public library are controlled by these state laws. So we got some combos up here. So not-for-profit corporation law and the education law, public health law and the real property law, or the executive law and the estates, powers, and trusts law. So yes, A is absolutely correct, right? So basically, as I said, for our board members here, the not-for-profit corporation law really is controlling a lot of things. How many of you have read your conflict of interest policy and thought, well, this could be simpler, right? You have the not-for-profit corporation law to thank for the layers of complexity and the definitions that are in that policy, but it does apply. Sometimes where even attorneys can get a little confused on this, the education law has some overlays that will have your board and your governance structure doing things a little bit differently, or a few extras beyond what's in the not-for-profit corporation law. So the two have to really be looked at together for things like the bylaws questions that your library system will be helping you with and things like that. So it gets complex, but this is, sometimes the real property law might affect your library if you're buying property, but it won't affect the day-to-day operations of your board. All right, trustees have to engage in at least how many hours of trustee training a year? There you go, very nice. Answer B, and you're getting one of them now, I believe. So there you go, congratulations. All right, Trustees with a conflict of interest. So back to ethics and conflict of interest. What do you have to do if you have a conflict of interest? Do you have to quit the board? Or do you have to recuse yourself before voting on an issue? Or do you have to just ignore it because conflict of interest is no big deal, right? 1, 2, 3. B. Very good. It's really, really simple. If your cousin is the person who actually is the best bidder for the library parking lot contract, right? Just say, hey, that's my cousin. I happen to think he's really good at paving parking lots, but you know what? That's up to you guys. I'm going to sit this vote out, right? I've disclosed, and I would like the secretary to note the disclosure of the conflict in the minutes. I'm filling out the form with a little update, and my recusal, my refusal to vote is going to be put in the minutes, right? So in that part in the minutes where it says ayes, nays, abstain, the abstention should be noted also as a recusal because the person's just saying, I declared a conflict and now I'm not going to vote on it. Hire my cousin anyway. No, don't say that. All right, last one of our warm-up questions. Can a board deny meeting attendees? And I don't mean other board members, I mean members of the public who want to show up. They have something very, very important to say to your board, to your director. Can a board deny meeting attendees the right to speak? So people might have some moral feelings about this because, of course, your library is there in one capacity or another to serve the public. That's the whole point. We talked about that. But if the rules of about governing speaking at your meetings are applied fairly and consistently, in other words, you're not saying, well, we want to hear from Peg and Sue, but we don't want to hear from Matt, right? He's a troublemaker, so we're not going to let him speak, right? That would be a violation and a potential legal problem, right? But if there are rules, so libraries approach this in all different ways, and only you are going to know which approach is right for your particular community. Do you come from a community where everybody needs to have their say and they need to have it for at least 10 minutes and you all love listening to that? Great. Have a policy that says everybody gets to speak for 10 minutes and our board meetings go on forever, right? If you come from a place where it's really important but you want people to keep it brief, you can say everybody has 2 minutes to speak. And you can do things like limit it to members of our community, right? People who live in our area of service, right? So you can think through how do you want to create the opening for that kind of input, and how do you want to be able to regulate it so it's not disruptive, right? So you're getting the right information, you're allowing that public input and that connection, that meaningful connection, but at the same time you're making sure that it doesn't get in the way of doing business. The other thing I will say to the boards here, and it's based on some things that I'm seeing from time to time now, is if anyone at the meeting in any way harasses, threatens, or demeans any other member, right, be ready to shut that down. And there are techniques for that. The policy that you have should encompass that, and a little bit of board practice. You can talk, I'm looking at Matt, like you can help them with that, right, Matt? Yes, Matt can help you with that, okay? And can talk about what is the preferred method of that. Because you don't want the fact that someone had to be ejected or shut down, right, during a meeting to become the news about your library. But at the same time, you do want to be ready, because I will say, no director here, no library employee, no volunteer should be subjected to any abuse, threats, harassment, or demeaning conduct because of the public service that they're providing. But you have to be ready to enforce that in the moment, okay? So that's, if you don't have a policy or a practice or have a script in your head for how to do that, and you are a library leader, that's a good one to consult with the system about. And just be ready, because this is America and we love to speak our mind. And sometimes people might say things that they need to be adjusted. So that is our warm-up quiz. So now we're going to move on. Round 2, Jeopardy-esque. And yes, that is a shameless trademark violation right there. I did not license the right to Jeopardy, but we're going to claim some kind of fair use for that one. So let's see here. All right. Here is what the board looks like. I didn't spring for the software. You actually can get the software to actually do Jeopardy-esque stuff. But these are our categories. What's in your library, if only, by the book, and financial literacy. Ooh, okay. All right. if you move to our first page, category 1, what's in your library? So we're just going to take these in order. Feel free to shout out answers, right? It's what you are happy to have when the roof leaks. Woo! Very good. 200 for all of you. Yes. One of the things that your trustees here should be thinking about is most definitely taking an annual look at the insurance coverage for the library and just asking this very simple questions, right? You don't have to be an insurance expert, but just saying, if the roof leaks, do we have coverage? If we get sued for an alleged contract violation or an employee has some sort of claim, do we have coverage? Just walking that through and finding an insurance advisor or a broker or someone who can give you the answers to those questions so that you know that the library has the right level of coverage. And it's going to change depending on your library and the relationships you have, especially for those of you, how many of your libraries are located inside a municipal building? All right, I have found that in a lot of those cases, there's a gray area because the town might assume the library has insurance and the library assumes the town has insurance, and then there's a fire and they find out that there's no coverage for those assets. So just asking those questions and then finding some answers. All right, 400. It's a service a library is required by law to have a policy about if it offers it. Internet, yes! See what's in your library? I had way too much fun writing these. Okay. Yes, so by law, per the education law, if your library offers internet access, you must have a policy governing the use of that internet access. And there's no, I've seen a variety of different policies. I imagine you have a template, you walk them through. So just making sure that that's there. And of course, that it's one of the policies that the trustees are reviewing once every 5 years, right? Especially because the internet does continue to evolve and you often have to think, the problems we were solving about internet use even 15 years ago are different than the ones we're confronting now, potentially. So, all right, 600. It's what your library is there to provide. Information, yes, there you go. That was probably at level 200, I don't know. Okay, for 800, it's what must be filled out if a library worker gets hurt on the job. Incident report, or I would also take an injury report, right? So one thing that every one of your libraries is required to provide by law is workers' compensation insurance. This is another gray area I've seen, and I've seen a couple libraries now fall in the cracks where, especially if your payroll is being administered by perhaps a helpful town or village that you're affiliated with, sometimes those employees are automatically included on the workers' compensation coverage. Sometimes they are not. And again, a lot of times libraries are finding this out in a reactive way, as in either once the library has been fined by the workers' compensation board for not having coverage, or when someone gets hurt. So this is another one just to poke at gently. How do we get our workers' compensation coverage? And making sure there's clarity about what do we do if a worker gets injured, right? Where do we keep those accident report forms? If any of you have an accident report form that hasn't been updated since, say, 1997, right? It might be time to just check in and make sure you're updating your forms. And also, your library should have a posting. You're required by law to post that you have the coverage, and so that the employees know it. For those of you who are researchers, and I'm looking, of course, at a room full of researchers, if I just made you nervous, one thing you can do is you can Google Workers' Compensation Board, New York State Workers' Compensation Board, and they have a great utility that says, does my employer have coverage? If you want to look me up, you can see that the Law Office of Stephanie Adams, PLLC, has coverage. This is one way that your library would be transparent about that. But if you don't have it, and your payroll is going through like a town or a county or some kind of partner, community partner or sponsor, then just making sure that that coverage goes along with it, that's a very important tip. And that's another one where if there's an accident, a trustee, of course, is not filling out the injury form unless they were the one who was injured on site, but that should be a different form anyway. But just making sure that the coverage is in place. That's the difference between the governance role, right? Just making sure things are there versus doing the administration of those things. Okay. Any questions about workers' compensation insurance? Yes. Right. No, that's a great question. So she said, they said I mentioned a sign, and what does the sign need to say? So the state of New York has answered that question in excruciating detail for you. So it is what needs to be, what needs to be on the form. The workers' compensation carrier should provide that to your library, and your library every employer in the state of New York should have a mandatory postings notice board. This is getting a little tricky now that some places, although not most libraries, are transitioning to a quasi-remote or maybe a 100% remote workforce. Where do you put your mandatory postings if you have no place, quote unquote, to post them? But for now, a break room, it's got to be a generally accessible area. It's where the minimum wage notice, the workers' compensation notice, there's a bunch of required notices. So those I have found tend to be areas in libraries that sometimes get a little dusty, right? Or I'm not picking on libraries. Some employers, right? They just haven't thought about that in years and years. It's a good one to look at on an annual basis. Maybe have a little party, right? I do that. Like when we update my mandatory posting area, we get muffins, because hey, so thank you. Muffins and mandatory posting. On a Monday. This is the kind of collaborative genius that makes libraries in New York strong. Okay, so, and for 1,000, it's the I in ILS. Integrated, yes. I put that in there because I can never remember that, ever. I always want to say interactive or, I don't know, intellectual, like it's just, but yes, your ILS. Very important. All right, moving on to, check my time too. How are we moving here? Oh, we're good. Okay. So, if only. So you'll probably, anybody want to guess what the IF stands for? Intellectual freedom. Yes, this is the topic of, it started out as a topic in 2021. It became a huge galloping topic in 2022, and we are not getting off the horse in 2023, right? Intellectual freedom is the right of free people to read freely. And, it's always ironic to me because for someone to protest there being a book in a library, they need to have the First Amendment right to engage in that protest, right? So right, it's very meta. So when I get reports about, well, we've got community members who are angry about this or that, and they're protesting, I cut my teeth on protest culture. I brought my 6-year-old to marches in 2020, right? And I love protest. I'm a First Amendment fan, and I love seeing people robustly engaging in the rights that we have in the United States to express ourselves, even when I don't agree with what they're saying, right? And so one thing I want to explore a little bit in this is there's a balance, though, between, of course, exercising your freedom, right, and doing so within the rules that society is allowed and has to set up around those things, right? And a lot of the folks who are engaging in this kind of protest now, from what I see, high school isn't really teaching a lot of this type of thing in civics classes anymore, if there are civics classes anymore. I'm looking at you, education department rep. You got to talk to them down the hall. So what I'm seeing is that people don't necessarily know that, yes, they're allowed to protest, but for instance, at the public library, we are allowed to put up some time, place, and manner restrictions in how they do that. I'm not going to focus on that too much, but I do want to say that the takeaways from here that you're going to see really talk about the nuances of that balance, that we should celebrate. And I know it's easy to sometimes talk down about people who think that they can bully the public library, and I get it, but at the end of the day, it's also people engaging in their First Amendment right, and giving them the skills to do that in a healthy way is a good thing, right? So that's what these skills are about. And at the same time, telling them that doesn't mean you get to harass, demean, abuse, and threaten or terrorize anybody, right? That's where the line, the First Amendment does not protect people from making threats. So, it's a value that requires unimpeded information access. You all said it already. Intellectual freedom, right? Very, very important. It's the office you call when there's a book ban. Anyone want to shout? Right, you can definitely call Paulette. I should have put that number on there. So the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom is a good one. There are many offices you should call, and yes, actually NCLS is one of them, but in this case, there's an IF office, an Intellectual Freedom Office at the American Library Association, and they are working very hard to track the different initiatives around the country to suppress certain authors, right, by threatening the libraries who are providing access to those authors. And by tracking that information, it is, well, first of all, where there's information, there's power, right? By tracking that information, the Office of Intellectual Freedom is able to put together the picture of what's happening countrywide and is also able to connect libraries and librarians to resources. I'll say this. So when I get called in to represent an institution a lot, I'm representing the institution. So if a board retains an attorney, that attorney is serving at the pleasure of the board, right? And the board is a decision-making body that deliberates together and then passes a resolution to maybe offer instructions to that attorney. At the same time, if there is something going on, for instance, if a library director has been targeted because of the library display or an event that's happening or books that are available on the shelves, that director has their own personal right as well. And sometimes that director might want to get their own personal attorney, right? Easy to say, who talked about the poverty rate for, yeah, right, for employees, right? So you tell anyone these days, okay, good, you just need $5,000 to retain an attorney. And they'll say, well, I guess I'm not retaining an attorney, right? Or they're going to have a GoFundMe. ALA has resources, right? So there's the ALA has the Merit Fund. Freedom to Read Foundation under the ALA maintains the Merit Fund to help librarians who are being targeted in this. So by calling the Office of Intellectual Freedom, they can help, number one, keep a 100,000-foot view on what's happening with the efforts to restrict access to certain authors. And at the same time, they can connect the different players, the library board versus the library staff versus maybe the friends of the library, to different resources that can help those people do what they need to do to protect themselves and their unique interests in the situation. So I don't expect any of you to memorize, retain attorney, separate attorney, call the insurance carrier, do all these things, but if you call ALA or if you call NCLS when that happens, sooner rather than later, right? If you get an inkling that an issue might be emerging, call, because sometimes what you do at the very beginning of a situation with, I call it the angry taxpayer scenario, right? You get the angry taxpayer or the scared mom, and they're coming in, and maybe they're coming in from a place of genuine engagement and love and saying, I'm really upset about this book or this display. By calling in back up right away, sometimes you can avoid the situation from becoming a more headline-grabbing situation. And it can be something that can really resolve well for the community. So do not be afraid to call in the cavalry. So that's one of the, it's the office you call when there's a book ban. But really just keep in mind that those resources are there all the time. NCLS can connect you to them. New York Library Association can connect you to them. There's an army waiting to help when it's needed. Okay, so for 600, it's an essential thing to have before a book challenge. Policy, yes, collection management policy. So this is a good one. If the collection management policy hasn't been looked in a while, this would be a good one to look at this year, and really having clarity about how do we decide to bring books in to the library or materials in, right? What are our collection criteria? When do we weed those books out, right? How might they be taken off the shelves, including if somebody challenges a book being there, right? And then how can any of that be appealed as well? So just making sure the policies are in order. There's resources on that, you know, if you need access to some presentations on that, there's a lot of information out there. There's model policies to follow. But the important thing is to have clarity about how that works. All right, for 800, in New York, it bars the removal of books based on the identity of the author. Anyone want to take a stab at that one? New York human rights law. I need someone to do like beep, beep, beep. It's New York human rights law. So in the state of New York, we have this wonderful thing. If you feel like Googling it, go for it. New York human rights law. It is a law that bars discrimination within the state of New York on the basis of many protected categories. Unlike the federal government, which has never really come straight out and said, that it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, et cetera, et cetera. The state of New York, we don't shy away from these things. We're like, no, you don't get to do that, and here's how. To the point where just this year, the New York State model policy barring sexual harassment in places of employment, like a library, has been revised to say that even intentionally misgendering someone can be a discriminatory act. So if you have yes, exactly, woo, right? If you have an employee who maybe has changed the pronouns that they use and they have let that be known, and you have a patron who insists, not because they are making mistakes, because everybody can make mistakes and mistakes happen, we are human, but people who are deliberately still misgendering that person at that point, once they have made their needs and their identity known, that actually could be a legal issue, because that type of discrimination is illegal in the state of New York. It creates a hostile work environment for your employee, right? So for those of you who have forward-facing staff, I just want to be really, really clear, right? So we'll get back to this book ban part in a second, but I do want to be really clear that while anybody who is doing public service, working retail, working the reference desk, right, has to work with a variety of people who may or may not be polite, right? Are there days when people just aren't polite and gracious? And guess what? You know what? It's still not illegal to be rude in the state of New York. We're all about rude. Rude is okay, right? But you just can't be discriminatory and hateful when you're being rude on the basis of protected categories. So, but anybody so if you have a frontline worker who maybe someone is making romantic advances on them that are unwelcome, right? Regardless of the gender dynamic or the sexuality dynamic, or someone who has their pronouns have changed. They have let the world know that. They've been very clear, but you have someone who's continuing to misgender them, right? That can lead to liability, right? For the library, if the employer does not take steps to stop that from happening. If your library doesn't have a really clear policy or confident skill set for helping to manage that type of concern, the sooner you call Matt and Paulette, the better, because they can connect you with who you might need to get through that. Because when I have gotten calls, so part of my practice, I do defense work in front of the New York State Division of Human Rights, who is the enforcement agency for the New York human rights law. And the division will cut employers slack when they know that what happened was a one-time event that the employer couldn't control, and it was an accident, or even if it was a one-time hateful thing, but then the employer stopped it, right? But if something keeps happening and happening, and the employer either outright or sort of passively tells the employee, you know what, this is library work, you just have to put up with it, right? That's not the case. And so there's a potential for liability. This law pertains to all types of libraries, does not matter, association, non-association, town, village, right? Doesn't matter. So it's very, very important. So if your library is addressing these things and just honestly, candidly looks in the mirror and says, we don't have the skill set to handle this, we can't handle the way society is changing, call and get some help, right? Because through some training, your library can really work on this and can become like a model for how to handle any type of issue that's presented under the Division of Human Rights Law. This directly ties in New York, this law bars the removal of books based on the identity of the author. So if a decision is made to remove a book from the shelf, and it becomes clear that that book was removed from the shelf because of the sexuality of the author, their gender expression, et cetera, that could actually be a constitutional violation. And the New York State Attorney General just came out with a written opinion about this, and there's guidance available, right? And so this all connects with the right we have in the state of New York to have information access, intellectual freedom, and at the same time, we have laws that are protecting to make sure that the work that people are doing or the information that they want to access isn't barred on the basis of a protected category. Man, woman, veteran status, for instance. So a general awareness of that is really, really important. And as these book challenges are coming up, if the content that's being protested is the same kind of content you would find in a book by another person on the shelf, right, then making a decision to take that particular book away based on the identity of the author, that risks a legal violation. So that's our $600 question. Any questions on that one before I move on? I threw a lot at you just now. It's really important though, and it's all connected. So, all right, I'm gonna let that sit for 1 second. So for 1,000, it's a primary tool for making sure the list of books isn't unfairly amended. Primary tool, not unfairly amended. Primary, amended. First Amendment. All right, so yay, civil liberties. All right, we're gonna move on to category 3, buy the book. Let me just check my time here, perfect. Okay, for 200, it's the formal legal term for buying things. Procurement, yes, yes. And I did hear accession out there, and so actually it's a really important distinction to make, right? Accessioning things is making the decision to bring them into a particular collection. Usually it's a term you hear in museum world, but for those of you, how many of you have like a rare books collection or something like that maybe you've accessioned things into, right? So accessioning is that choice to let something into a collection. Procurement is just buying stuff, right? So here's where this can get really important, just to connect it a little bit to our intellectual freedom topic. So if someone wants to, how many of the libraries here are subject to freedom of information law? No, association libraries, you can chill out. You are not subject to the freedom of information law. You are subject to the open meetings law, but you are not subject to the freedom of information law. So yeah. Oh yeah, so right, so a FOIL request will come in and it will ask for things, and there are things by law that all of the non-association libraries have to follow some record retention requirements from the state of New York. One of the things that a library has to hold on to are purchasing records. Purchasing records, which are actually the records generated by the act of purchasing things, like an invoice, paying for something, that has to be retained for at least a year. If not more. I think it's a 1-year retention period. The records related to the act of, so how many of you are selecting books for your libraries? Like you're doing, right. Records related to the selection of books have to be retained for 0 years or 0 time at all after you're done needing those records. So think about this from the perspective of the angry taxpayer, right? Who says, I want all the records that this librarian generated when they thought about buying the following, nasty, nasty books, right? I want to see what was going through their heads. If your library follows state records laws, your library can say, we don't have those records. We don't keep them. You can't get them, even if we're subject to FOIL, because you don't have to retain them. If they say, well, I want to see how much money you spent on these nasty, nasty books, you can say, sure, here's the procurement records, okay? So it's really important to have a records policy that distinguishes between selection of materials and actually buying the materials. And if all of you are just like, I didn't follow that at all, I just wrote an Ask the Lawyer about it last week, and it'll be up, and you can read it, and it's footnoted, and you don't have to worry about writing any of that down. Okay, but for those of you, if your libraries haven't looked at the records retention policy in a while, for the non-association libraries, the state of New York has this wonderful resource. It's called the LGS1, and it's a list of different types of records and how long you have to keep them. And I think it's a good practice. If you don't have to keep records, don't keep them, unless you are deciding that they're so valuable you want to create an archive out of them, which is wonderful. An archive is there to be shared, right? So if you want to create an archive that showcases your content selection records, that's wonderful, but you don't have to have them, okay? And this is how you can use the law and policy to mediate your relationship with people who might be coming in a little bit aggressively about the operations of a library. So formal legal term for buying things, procurement. And you should have a procurement policy because it's one of the things people always want to see these days. All right, 400, the mandatory retention period for records relating to buying library materials. Related to buying, not selecting. 1 year, there we go. Very good. All right, so 600, the mandatory retention period for records related to selecting library materials. Woo! Oh, you're all with me, I love it, okay. 800, it's the reason a library never pays sales tax. Tax exempt, exactly right. This is just something to keep an eye on. If you have folks who are going out and engaging in procurement on behalf of your library, right, making sure they have the documentation for your tax exempt status is important. This even, for those of you who have done construction projects, you're probably familiar with this. This can even come down to the procurements that your contractor has to engage in to buy supplies for doing those construction contracts, right? So just always make sure you're not paying tax or being charged for tax through a vendor when you don't have to pay it. It's just a little, I don't know, what do we call it? A pro tip? Pro tip, right? Make sure you're not paying, your library isn't paying tax that it doesn't have to. 1,000, something that should be carefully reviewed for privacy and security assurances before it is signed. Anything. You know what, these days, that's a really valid answer, 1,000 points. Yeah, what I had in mind here was actually database contracts, right? So when your library is buying content these days, it's not just buying books and media, right? It's also buying a ton of digital content. And taking a look at what are the privacy and security arrangements in those contracts is really important. And checking in with the system about what are the best practices when your library itself, now a lot of contracts the system will be entering into on your behalf, and then you're going to tap into that shared resource. But if your library is doing its own licensing for a product, a digital product that your patrons will be interacting with, asking really just fundamental questions. What information will you be gathering? How is that information stored? If there's a data breach of that information, how will you let us know, right? How will you help us get the word out, right? As individuals, you have power, but together as purchasers, the libraries of New York have amazing purchasing power, and you can influence your vendors if you give them feedback about things like privacy and security, right? But if you don't give them feedback and you're not kind of leading with that as a priority, that privacy could get left on the floor. And frankly, it's getting left on the floor everywhere. You folks are some of my last hope on this issue. I'm such a curmudgeon about privacy, and it's getting left. And so, but this is one of the libraries and academic institutions should be paying deep, deep attention to, right? What information is being gathered? How is it being stored? How is it secured? Will it be sold? And will it be sold either in its own format with the primary information, or will it be sold in a sort of disaggregated format? That's valuable. That's value that your library could be creating for a vendor that you don't necessarily want to do. So on a practical level, I would say if your library is considering entering into any type of database contract on its own, getting in touch with NCLS to just talk over the contract to make sure that you've got someone to bounce ideas about privacy off of. Very, very important. You're the last hope of privacy. So, all right. Everyone's favorite topic, financial literacy. Check my time here. Okay. So it's something that belongs to the library, even if it is held by another.
Library funds.
Library funds. I want to just really because I see so much of this problem, we'll talk about the problem in a minute, I would appreciate if you would all just say, that's our money. 1, 2, 3. That's our money, okay? Thank you. That felt really good. So whether your town or your village or whomever, your school district, if they are holding some bank accounts for the library, that's really nice of them. You can send them a card on an annual basis. Thank you for being our fiscal agent, right? But it is your money. And more now, I am seeing towns and villages that are using the library account like their slush fund. Yeah, and something tells me that like the brisk independents of the North Country might be particularly resistant to this phenomenon. So maybe you're just like, I know that's my money. Like, we know that's our money. But it really is, even if a town or a village is very kindly being a fiscal agent, it is the library's money, right? And the trustees are the fiduciary of that money, and making sure it's being spent and stewarded in the right way is the responsibility, one of the primary responsibilities of the trustees. So sometimes, I just want to mention a little bit more about this. So sometimes it's flat out, yeah, we're going to rob Peter to pay Paul. We're going to rob the library to pay, the parks department. I mean, I've seen that. But also it can be a little more subtle, like they wanting to include certain lines of the library, like if you have like a cash reserve, if you have a reserve fund that you're holding from year to year, wanting to put that in a different fund so that the town can pump up. Yeah, I know, this sounds crazy. I got raised eyebrows up here. So it's like to be able to show that they have more money in reserve to bump up a credit rating. Right, so for anyone who wants to delve into this stuff, the New York State Comptroller has a wonderful manual that's the like local government accounting guide. If you Google that, there are actual codes for how library funds are supposed to be coded. So there's a I am not an accountant. You would not want me to do your taxes. My husband is a CPA. I don't know how we've managed to stay together because we see the world so differently. But anyway, but I can say this. There are very precise codes for how, if you have a town or a village or a county government who is the financial agent for your money, who's holding your library's money, there are very precise codes that they need to be using when they do financial reports of how they hold that money and how they expend that money. And if any of the library's money isn't tied to the appropriate code, to me, that's a little red flag, right? And as, do we have any treasurers in the room? There we go. So we have some treasurers. Oh, they're all clustered in the back. That's cool. We've got the trustee cabal and one outlier up here. So for the treasurers, if any of you have towns or villages or any fiscal agents who are holding the money for the library, when you ask for an accounting report, you're getting a very, very clear answer and a very orderly report. Because I will tell you this, from what I've seen, I couldn't do it myself, but from what I've seen, if the library needs a report about where the accounts are at, the person who has that information should be able to go, sure thing, boop, right, and print it out. When I've had some libraries who have asked for that information and they get, oh, only Pat knows how to do that. She only works on Wednesdays. Someone's nodding a lot. You're nodding a lot. Yeah, like when people start to do like this little dance, there's something funky going on. Because that might be indicative of financial concern, that's a red flag. But of course, when financial concerns come up, they're not just financial concerns. They're relational concerns. They're trust concerns. And for those of you in smaller, well, you know what? This is not a small community thing. When this happens in big old Buffalo, where I live, it's still a big to-do, right? It's like a family fight, right? Because suddenly you have trust issues happening. So if you start getting those red flags, it really is good to touch base and develop a strategy, especially if a fiscal concern happens at the same time when you're hoping to build alliances for things like going out on a ballot, right? So I keep looking at poor Matt and Paulette and handing them work to do, but these really are. This is if you get like a little red flag about monies being held for your library, start strategizing on that. The answer should be there. There should be no mysteries about money, none, right? And if there are, that is a mystery that needs to be solved. So there you go. Okay, so 400. It's something that must be charged if the library is selling items unrelated to its mission. Sales tax. Oh, you guys are so on. Yes. So a lot of times what the library might be selling could be related to its mission, but this is just something, if your library is planning on selling things, or if the friends are planning on selling something, checking in with the library's accountant to make sure that they feel comfortable with that expenditure being reported as something that is consistent with the mission of the library. That's a good thing to check in on, just to be extra sure. An example of things, yes. Book sales could potentially be one, right? By friends, potentially. T-shirts, supplies and equipment, craft sales. So if there's a craft sale at the library, if the sales are going, so I had one asked the lawyer, really, I felt like such a villain. The local artisans wanted to get together and hold a craft sale, and all the proceeds were going to go to the library. And I was like, that's so beautiful, but I still think they need to charge sales tax. And we were trying to figure out, because it really does come down to how do you connect it to mission, right? So I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's as soon as a library starts selling things, it's good to get an answer from your accountant. That's cool. Because as soon as you have a licensed professional that you can blame a mistake on, this is the life I lead, right? This is why I have malpractice insurance, right? As soon as you get an answer from someone like that, in writing, right? Not just like, the trustee's cousin who's an accountant who they talk to in Wegmans. Oh, you guys don't have Wegmans up here, do you? So you do. Oh, you do. Okay, yeah, Wegmans, the Wegmans talk, right? That's not good. But if you send out the question and say, hey, we want to sell the following thing as part of a fundraiser, is that going to count? Do we need to charge sales tax? And if you get someone saying no, you're all set, right? So it's just a little issue to have. Yes?
So we have a friends in the library group, and they are a non-for-profit.
Mm-hmm.
They have to charge sales
They might, right. And that question, so the question was, if you have a Friends of the Library group and they're a not-for-profit, if they're selling things, do they have to charge sales tax? They might, right? So the example I always give on this is, when I was an in-house counsel at a university, the university sold athletic apparel with the Division I team on it, right? So even though it was apparel related to the university, they charged sales tax when they sold that apparel, that branded apparel. Even though the university itself was a not-for-profit, they did not pay sales tax. So, right, that's the difference between being tax exempt, as in you don't have to pay it, versus when do you have to charge it, right? The two can sometimes be confused. So, and just a real quick thing on the Friends, that's a great question. So most Friends of the Library are going to be an independent organization that has their own 501c3, right? They're a separate not-for-profit corporation. They have their own 501c3, and they're filing their own tax papers. I have seen where some Friends groups are kind of unofficial, right? And they just sort of are a ride-along initiative of the library, in which case, really, all of their activities have to be reported as part of the operations of the library. That's not impossible, but it just means that they do have to follow the rules of the library, and the library just needs to take that into account, right? It's not a problem until it's a problem. So, but if with good planning, it's not a problem. So there we go. 5 minutes, thank you. All right, so, for 600, it's something used to encourage financial transparency between a library and its friends. I heard MOU. Yes, ding, 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 very good. So you can call it whatever you want, by the way. You can call it an agreement. You can call it a peace accord. You can call it whatever you want. Contract is fine. A lot of times memorandum of understanding is something that is intended to not be enforceable. Once a library has a contract with a friends group, my tendency is to say it should be enforceable, because the library is letting the friends use its name, right? In effect, is licensing its name to that friends group, and is saying to the friends group, we're letting you raise funds in our name, and that means you're gonna give the funds to us when we need them, right? So if anyone is interested in this topic, I have a really fun Ask the Lawyer that is called Friends Not Acting So Friendly. I did not come up with that title. It was the person who submitted the question, right? So what happens when the relationship deteriorates? You never want it to get to that point, right? You want things to stay on a good footing. And so having that MOU, that contract, that agreement, whatever it's going to be, ideally it's also supported by the bylaws of both organizations. Like that's how deep that should go. Okay, 800. It's what's used to make sure a donation doesn't become a headache. Yeah, a policy, yes, policy is a good one. And also a donor letter, a deed of gift, exactly right. Okay, clarity. Because a lot of times donors will say, well, I'm going to give you $1 million, and that means you're going to sculpt the dome of the library to look like my face. And you say, we're not going to do that. You can keep your money. But if there isn't clarity about that, then the only people who are happy out of the situation are the lawyers who are paid to fight it out. You don't want to have happy lawyers, so just use a deed of gift. And that is, I think, by the way, there's a lot of forms. People like to go to Google for deeds of gift. Every one of you has an attorney in your town who's practicing estate law, elder law. Those, you don't need like a library lawyer. You don't need a fancy specialty niche lawyer. Any lawyer who knows how to write a will be able to help you come up with a good deed of gift for your particular library. Because really it's all about having clear terms for that gift. And if your library has a policy for saying, no, we don't do face donations, you don't even really need to waste a lot of time talking about a contract, right? So a good policy and then a good template that your library's lawyer doesn't have to be like a fancy schmancy lawyer, right? Has looked at, that's really important. And get a written opinion from that lawyer, because you don't want the lawyer who just kind of, again, was at Wegmans and was like, yeah, that seems cool. You want a written opinion by someone who stands by what they write and has malpractice insurance. That's the gold star. All right, and the final, 41000. It's a restricted account that can be used for limited purposes, and usually only the income it generates is used. Endowment, yes. I hope all of you have really big and growing endowments, and if you don't, it's not too late to start, right? So you just need some seed money and to bring that in. An endowment can be held by any type of library, right? So for those of you who are public libraries, it gets a little tricky because there's some risk in accumulating money when you're still going to the taxpayers to say, we need routine operating funds. One of the ways that you can keep going to the public to say, we need you to support us routinely, is if you have money coming in that's restricted. So for instance, if you get $1 million gift that says you can only use the interest of this gift for having fellowships for local authors, right? Even though the library has that money is burdened by the donor. So that, again, is the kind of thing that a policy that you have and a lawyer is helping you draft local deeds of gifts. They can help any type of library to set that up so that if someone wants your library, regardless of the type, to be the focal point of their generosity, it can be done. It just needs to be planned really well by someone who has done that type of gift planning before. That's the big thing. If there's an attorney who says, I'm going to help you, and you say, have you done this before? And they say, no, but I'm a great DWI attorney. That's awesome. Call them if you get pulled over for a DWI, which you never will, right? But don't have, you wouldn't have me do your DWI, and just pick a lawyer who's done that kind of planning before. Don't be afraid to ask them, can we talk to another client of yours who's done this kind of thing, just to find out what it's like to work with you? You can definitely comparison shop. And and then the money can come in, and hopefully you can do all those amazing things that Lauren was asking you about, right? You can build the bigger room, you can pay the employees more, all those wonderful things can happen. And so I think with that, I'm at time. I'm at time. It has been so great talking with all of you. Some of you I'm going to talk with afterwards, and thank you.